Hi, this is Professor Spellman with another introductory lesson to one of the greatest artists who's ever lived, Michelangelo Buonarroti. Known and I've studied many artists throughout the world, as well as civilizations and groups of people, but this one is one of the most versatile that has ever lived. A contemporary of his was Leonardo da Vinci, and unfortunately, they didn't get along during the time in which they lived, which was during the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. It means the rebirth of many of the values and many of the ideals and many of the styles of the early Greeks and Romans. And of course, the human body was the center of activity for the Greeks. The body is the temple of the soul. So when we talk about the Renaissance, the 15th century or so, we're talking about a period of time in art in which there was a rebirth of the style of the works of the Greeks and the Romans. Michelangelo was one of those. I've chosen him for an assignment, familiarization assignment for you, because this man was so versatile. He had many works that he created. Matter of fact, he started many projects that he never finished, but then those he finished were just absolutely spectacular. We're looking at just a peek of his David, and then we will see his Moses, and we will see other biblical characters. Why? Because the church had sole responsibility between the 3rd century and 15th century in teaching Christianity and Bible works. But the people could not read and write. Gutenberg didn't invent the wheel, the printing press to the 14th century. So they had sculpture and painting to teach religion. One of his most famous works, Michelangelo, we call it his first Pietà, he created when he was just 25 years of age, and we will study that piece. But he did 4 Pietàs. A Pietà is Mary mourning over the crucified body of Christ. To your right is a pictorial representation of his David, a piece of sculpture which is in Florence, Italy, 18 feet high. He carved out of a single block of marble. So he did with the Pietà. Matter of fact, he was and considered himself a sculptor. His Moses, which if Moses were to stand up, would be 10 feet tall, very muscular, representing that physique that the Greeks admired and portrayed. And then most people know Michelangelo for his ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, 33 panels, talking about religious Old Testament subjects, which when you looked up, you would receive a visual lesson, biblical lesson, and that was the focal point from which much was taught in religion. He was very loyal to a man who was a mentor of his, Lorenzo de' Medici, or Lorenzo the Magnificent, who recognized him as a youngster and put him in the palace with all of the Medici family. And he was so grateful. This man died, his hero, and he dedicated a family chapel where he would have more than 40 pieces of sculpture upon it. And then, of course, in the Sistine Chapel, we have a painting which we call The Last Judgment. Took him 5 years to do. The ceiling took him 4.5 years. But the Last Judgment took him 5 years. Then there's a low relief that he did when he was just 15 years of age. And a low relief is where the surface just slightly rises and we see the shadows. So we want to look at some of these works. Perhaps one of the most famous is the Dome of St. Peter's. So as we begin to look at this man, we see all of his works were the epitome of excellence, of hard work, of versatility, and of course, excellence in achievement. No one produced like this man, except his rival, who was Leonardo da Vinci. But da Vinci was both scientist and he was engineer, while Michelangelo did many things in a very versatile career in art. To the left is a painting called, that's in the Sistine Chapel, and that's God touching Adam, giving him life. And of course you see the physique of the Greek Herculean figure, the human body as the most beautiful form in the world. And then you had the man with the beard there, many say was his father. He would paint his heroes into his paintings, and that's done in what we call a fresco, a painting in wet plaster. Then on the right is the Pietà I just told you about. He created when he was just 25 years of age, but it was so remarkable because the finger that sticks out, he did it out of one block of marble. Had he chipped or had he miscalculated, had he broken off that finger, he knew marble so well, and he knew physiology so well, that he created this work, this masterpiece. Then down on the bottom right, we'll talk about it a little later, it says Moses. If that Moses were to stand up, he'd be 10 feet tall. He smacked you, you go flying a long way. Look at his legs, look at his arms, where the imitation or the recreation of the Greek style and the Roman style came forward, that manhood, that muscular, well-fit physique came forward. And Michelangelo lived 89 years, good number of years, because many people died earlier. They didn't have the medical technology that we have today. But he was born in 1475 and he died in 1564. But the fact is, he lived 89 years, and I will show you one of his works. His last Pietà he worked on 2 weeks before he died. And to just chip away that marble was part of his whole life. But the reason why we want to study him for a few moments is the fact that he was so versatile. He was a master of sculpture. He was a master of painting. He was a master of architecture, designed the dome of the St. Peter's Basilica or Cathedral. He was a poet, wrote many sonnets, and he was a fortification engineer. That's what you call a versatile individual. And Michelangelo never really saw himself as a painter until Pope Julius told him to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. We pronounce his name Michelangelo Buonarroti because we use the vowel system of the Europeans, but at age 25, he carved that Pietà that I just pointed out to you from a single block of marble. That finger is considered the most fragile piece of carving ever achieved in marble. He had a tendency to place his heroes, the heroes of his life, into the biblical characters presented in his works, and he loved and he studied human anatomy to the point where it was almost unbelievable, but he would sneak into the morgues and he would cut up bodies and study all kinds of muscle structures and what have you. And many physicians came to Michelangelo when a patient had a pain in a specific area. Michelangelo knew exactly where it was. But his greatest works were considered to be his sculptural works. This is the Pietà that's the way we pronounce it. We usually put an accent over the A, that he created at 25. Some say 24. Can you imagine a single block of marble? How he could, with his skill and his knowledge and his understanding of the human figure, could create this work as though the cloth looked like it was flowing in the wind. He had a mastery over marble, and he would cut it away from a single block of marble. And look at that finger. Had he miscalculated, had he misunderstood, had he taken the chisel, he did this with chisels and he polished it, small chisels, big chisels, but look at what he was able to create. Now, where is all of this artwork located? Well, Michelangelo is very present here in what we call the Vatican. They have the St. Peter's Basilica. It is the head today of the Roman Catholic Church, and it is a place where the Pope lives. And we have buildings that all art students, art history and art appreciation students should know. First of all, to the bottom left is St. Peter's Square. Thousands of people gather there twice a week when the Pope has an audience on the 12 o'clock on Wednesday and on Sunday. It drops down from his residence here, which we'll look at a little bit later. That little building back there is the Sistine Chapel. Here's that same scene at night with thousands of people in St. Peter's Square. And here's the way it looks when you come up close to it. That is the Sistine Chapel, one of the most famous places in the world. It is here where the popes are elected. In other words, all the popes, when a pope dies, a new pope is elected in this room. All the cardinals come in from all over the world, and they come to this room. In the ceiling, you see 33 panels of Old Testament scriptural representations by Michelangelo. I was a little disappointed when I first saw it because it looked like it was muddy. It looked like it was sculpture more than a painting. But they did a cleaning about 30 years ago where they went up into the ceiling and they went foot by foot and they cleaned the Sistine Chapel. We found out that Michelangelo was quite a colorist. To the far wall in the back, this painting back here, that's called The Last Judgment. It took him 4.5 years to do the ceiling, and it took him 5 years to do The Last Judgment. That means 9.5 years of his life. You're looking at the work of Michelangelo. The Sistine Chapel was not air-conditioned. The Sistine Chapel did not have a heating system, so he worked in the cold and he worked in the heat to produce. He would work day and night. He built his own scaffolds. So 9.5 years. And he used a medium we call fresco. Most artists don't use that today, but it was a permanent. It was almost like oil paint. In those days, it was painting mixed with wet plaster. Painting mixed with wet plaster. Once dried, it was as solid and long-lasting. So here's the way the Sistine Chapel looks as you look through the doors after it has been cleaned, a marvelous place. And to know that you're in the same room where Michelangelo Buonarroti worked for 9.5 years. In the ceiling, you can see how colorful it is, but this is after the cleaning. 33 panels of Old Testament scriptural stories that are presented in the Bible. Remember, the people could not read, but they could. And art has always been a tool for teaching, visual teaching. And I enjoy being a visual teacher. You see Adam and Eve. In other words, they use a number of Old Testament scriptures, and then he went from panel to panel. He had to enlarge it, and he had to make it larger than it was. He had to work with scale. But there you see those 33 panels. And then toward the front, you see the Last Judgment. He also designed the Dome of St. Peter's. St. Peter's is a basilica. A basilica is a church. And of course, you see the front of it here. But that dome, which identifies Rome, just like when you look at New York, you see the Empire State Building symbolizing New York. So it is when you look at St. Peter's or you look at Rome. You see the Dome of St. Peter's. On the right is where the Pope lives, over here. And as I said, twice a week, on Wednesday at 12 o'clock and Sunday at 12 o'clock, a window opens and the microphone goes up and a banner comes down and he addresses sometimes thousands of people in St. Peter's Square. Now this is a close-up of the Last Judgment. Dante wrote a poem or a piece of literature called The Inferno. And it talked about how one day there will be a judgment day when Christ will come back with all the people who have done well, and he will take them under him, but then he will stomp out the evil. So you see a division here between those who are ascending up to heaven and then those who are going into purgatory. And here, this was used. Notice in the center, you've never seen a picture of Christ without a beard or long hair. But Michelangelo made this into representing that physical Greek, perfect, masculine form. And he showed him much differently. So between these two, you're talking about 9.5 years. The ceiling with 33 panels and the Last Judgment, 5 years. The room where all popes are elected. Then this building, as I told you before, is where it's the residence of the Pope. And he lives on the top floor and he addresses the people in the square. This is St. Peter's Square. It's a beautiful place. You have an obelisk representing that Rome did conquer Egypt. And you see all of the pieces of sculpture around representing the saints who have been given their designation. So each of those pieces of sculpture there represents one of the saints. And then in St. Peter's Square is an Egyptian obelisk. They don't allow cars in here anymore. I remember when they did. And then, of course, they had a celebration, redid it. No one comes in here unless you walk. You don't drive in this St. Peter's Square. The colonnades, you have the Greek representation of the column, the pediment, and, of course, the columns and the arches. And so we see Greece and Rome, Roman architecture here in its presence. And there's the Sistine Chapel. And it's hard to believe, but Michelangelo spent 9.5 years of his life in that building. This is a sample of one of the main centerpieces of the 33 panels. This is supposedly representing God touching Adam, giving him life. But notice how the male figure looks like a Greek Herculean athlete. And then the figure of God with the beard, he would put, and many said that was an image of his hero, his own father. So, in the sense, point by point, Michelangelo was encouraged by a man by the name of Lorenzo de' Medici, or Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was the ruler of Florence. And one day he was walking in the garden and he saw Michelangelo doing a carving. He wasn't even 20 years of age as yet. And he so admired it. And then he came back and he saw where Michelangelo had made some changes and even enhanced it. And he invited Michelangelo to come into the palace there in Florence and to live with the Medicis, which was the ruling family of Florence. He did many things. I said he designed the Dome of St. Peter's. He completed a number of poetic sonnets and poems and writings. And then he completed a number of what we call engineering fortifications against attacks. So the Last Judgment here, took him 5 years. Every figure in here moves. And there was a cardinal who did not like the idea of Michelangelo presenting the human body in nude form. And he used to complain about it. And Michelangelo felt that the body was the most beautiful form in the world. So on the left over here, what he did, Michelangelo got so irritated, he painted those who are ascending into heaven, but he painted those going to purgatory. And he put the cardinal who had given him a hard time and took him and put him there, wrapped him with a serpent. And the cardinal got so mad, he went back and he complained to the Pope, but the Pope said, I cannot take you out of here. I can put you and help you get in heaven, but I cannot help you out of hell. So that painting remains today, that cardinal who kept irritating. So when you walk in the Sistine Chapel, students on the left, there's sometimes 400 or 500 people there, and yet you can feel almost the presence of Michelangelo and what he was able to do. As I told you before, he designed the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. Basilica is a church. You can go up in an elevator, and I've done it many times, and you can walk around the dome up there. That dome sits over the spot where St. Peter was crucified upside down. So you see part of the canopy there, but that's the dome that Michelangelo designed. And what you see there, St. Peter's facade, St. Peter's Basilica, Basilica. A basilica is a church. Here's our Sistine Chapel over here on the right. Here is the front. Here's the canopy where the Pope came down during a holy year, and it was celebrated from here twice a week. But that dome, Michelangelo's presence was in his architecture, in his painting, and in his sculpture. Facade means the front. So this is the front of St. Peter's. Then you go inside. And of course the Romans gave us the arch as an architectural innovation that has revolutionized the world. They were able to build churches. They were able to build and put windows, able to build all kinds of things because of the arch. The Romans had given us that. And this canopy here was designed by Bernini, who was a Baroque artist, but it's the spot that marks where Peter was crucified. Now, all of the popes are buried underneath this canopy. Peter was the first, and he asked to be crucified upside down. He felt he was not worthy as Christ was created, so he asked to be upside down, right at that spot. And some 240-some folks that have come after him are all buried downstairs. You can go and take a stairway down and look at all of the popes' tombs, including John Paul II and many we knew. This is what we call a part of the transept. But in St. Peter's Basilica, it's the largest church, Catholic church in the world. It is a magnificent piece of architecture, one that you will want to stay, but you can appreciate the design work of Michelangelo Buonarroti. Another one of his famous works is his David. His David. This 18-year-old, the Greeks believed that 18 to 21 was were your years of productivity, your years of your zenith time, your highest point in your life. Because many people didn't live more than 40 and 45. But Michelangelo, again, took a single piece of marble and he carved this 18-foot presentation of David, this perfect athlete. And many times, David and Goliath are portrayed with Goliath's head, and David's cut it off with a sword. But in this case, this represents David just before he decided, or when he decided, that he was going to fight. So he is presented, and the human body is presented in nude form as an art form, as a tool of beauty. And that's the way it was in Greek and Roman times. Look at how he portrayed this 18 feet high. And when you go to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, you will see a replica of it outside in the square, but then you will go inside the Uffizi Gallery and you will see his original David standing there 18 feet high. And as the sculptor has said, yes, a painter has many colors that they can portray a person, but a sculptor uses light and shadow. And a sculptor, as you move around its 360-degree radius, you see a different picture of that piece of sculpture every time you move. So here's this David. He studied anatomy so much so that you can see the veins in his hand, in his arm. He knew every muscle in the body and presented it that way. Now, Michelangelo did more than one Pietà, and you might want to focus in on this, but he did 4 Pietàs. What is a Pietà? It is Mary mourning over the crucified body of Christ. What is a Madonna? A Madonna is when you see Mary with Christ's child. Usually it's called Madonna and Child. So in this case, we see where Michelangelo did 4 Pietas, the one we saw earlier, and 3 others. And this last one, which is the one in the center, one might say it's unfinished, but many believe its simplicity and its power is more powerful than any of the others. He worked on that piece 2 weeks before he died, when he was 89 years old. He put himself into the one on the left, where again, Mary mourning over the crucified body, but he put himself in as a disciple, put him a self-portrait. Here's the one he created when he was 25. Look at this, how magnificent he handled the marble, and he polished the marble, and he worked with a chisel. And today, this original piece, which came to the World's Fair way back in '64 in New York, but this piece is behind bulletproof glass. Some individual, and sometimes we have crazies, they want to be destructive, and they want to have a big play on something. And about 30 years ago, a man took a hammer and began to try to chip it away, and they called him the Swiss Guard, is what they're like, the police force of the Vatican. And they were able to put those and substitute those glues and put it back, but then they put it behind a big glass, bulletproof glass. But we can walk and we can see it, and I've been this close to it, and it's just magnificent, where you see that one slip of the chisel, he could have destroyed it. The sculptors of that day, if you chipped off the foot or the finger, they would consider it to be destroyed. Not like today, where you can go to Home Depot and get you some glue or seal. No, this was a magnificent piece. Today it's in the back of St. Peter's Basilica. Here's a close-up of that finger. Just think, had he miscalculated and chipped off that thumb or that finger, look at how he made Mary. Most people who studied the life of Christ know that he lived 33 years on this earth, but he made her to look like she was 14, 15 years of age. So they said, how did you make the Virgin Mary younger looking than her son? And he said she represented a pictorial purity, perpetual purity. And that's why. And that's the power of an artist to do that. Michelangelo designed many libraries and stairs and many buildings, many plazas, or he didn't. This is the cathedral at Milan, but a lot of influences there. And he also, we have this equestrian. An equestrian is a horse and rider. Remember that. Every year in Madison Square Garden, they have the equestrian show where the horse jumps over an obstacle. And last but not least, this is his Moses. His Moses. It sits around the corner in a church called San Pietro, not St. Peter's Basilica. The Pietà is in St. Peter's Basilica, but this Moses in a church called San Pietro. And what a piece of work it is. Biblical scholarship tells us that Moses lived to be 120 years of age. And yet that body and those arms and those legs and that physique looked like a Greek athlete. He was able to move and a single piece of marble again and carve this Moses. Had this piece of sculpture stood up, it'd probably be about 10 feet tall. So, look at his Moses. Now, he sits in what we call a niche. A niche is N-I-C-H-E. We've heard that. It's like a closet that the door's been taken off. And many sculptors like to put their works in the niche because the shadow behind it formed a frame. So this is his Moses.